The bad news is I got sick for a little bit. The good news is that meant I was sitting at home running benchmark after benchmark after benchmark while trying to get feeling better, because apparently that's how I do it. Now, this let me test a massive number of interesting configurations in Unreal Engine 5 games. And I'm using the 4060 Ti 8GB model and 16GB model, not because they make sense, for example, at 4K Ultra settings, but because it allows us to take two GPUs that are basically the same GPU, but with different VRAM amounts. Now, some people are like, what about the 3060 8GB versus 12GB? Well, those cut down more than just the VRAM. They change the memory bus. Or the 3080 10GB versus 12GB. Those, again, also change the memory bus. With the 4060 Ti 8GB and 16GB model, there's really no other change other than the doubling of the VRAM capacity, so that we can see when there's things like a massive difference in the 1% lows, that this is being caused by the difference in VRAM capacity and not other differences between the GPUs. Now, where does things like running out of VRAM show up in other stats? Well, if you look at the frame time graph here, you can see that the 8GB card is showing these massive spikes. Those are stutters. It can be hard to tell when you're watching a YouTube video, if the footage is stuttery or not, because it can't really accurately portray a variable refresh rate experience. But the frame time graph shows stutters. Another place we can see this is that the 16GB card is allocating a little bit over 8GB of VRAM here. And the system RAM allocation is around 13GB, and the actual usage is a little under 6GB. The 8GB card can't allocate more than 8, but the system RAM usage also goes up a little bit. This is an indication that the 8GB card is probably having to push some information into system memory instead of keeping it in VRAM because it runs out, causing these kinds of frame time spikes and other issues, like, for example, the game actually just flat out crashing, which is what we see right here. The game just couldn't handle it at these settings. So that's what we see when we run out of VRAM. Now, when you see the performance in these games and the VRAM amounts, you might be like, I need to upgrade my GPU. And if you're thinking about that, today's sponsor, Jawa.gg, can help you out so much. And also, you can use code OWIN10 to save $10 off your first purchase when you follow the link in the video description and pinned comment. Now, how can they help you out? There's actually a whole bunch of stuff they have here. One thing is that they have a used market, which your dollar can stretch so much further when you're buying used rather than new. So that's awesome. They also have a holiday gift guide where they show, like, best gifts under $100 or under $200 or under $500. There's the Ultimate Tech Tuber gift guide, where different tubers recommend different hardware in different price ranges. Lots of cool stuff you could follow here. Again, shopping gifts by price, all sorts of options. And the last thing I'll mention is that you can stretch your budget by selling your GPU to Jawa to then fund your upgrade. I know a lot of people hold on to their old graphics cards because they don't want to deal with the hassle of selling it. Maybe selling locally, you're scared of meeting somebody and getting mugged when you're handing over a bunch of cash, that kind of thing. Click this option to get an instant offer from Jawa. It's super simple. You just tell them the GPU model and condition, ship it, you print your free shipping label that's factored into the cost of shipping. They inspect it, everything checks out. Most sellers get paid within 1 business day. So again, sell your old hardware to fund your upgrade, get good used deals on Jawa, and again, $10 off your first purchase. Follow the link in the video description and pinned comment. Let's go ahead and get back to the benchmarks. So again, you can run out of VRAM and actually crash the game, but different settings and different resolutions have an impact on the amount of VRAM that needs to be used. For example, using DLSS, in this case we're staying at 4K Ultra, but we're running DLSS Performance mode. that reduces the internal rendering resolution of the game to 50% of each axis, which in this case would be dropping from 4K to 1080p internal render, but it doesn't run as fast as 1080p native would because then it takes the time to reconstruct a 4K-like image. It doesn't look the same, but closer to 4K than 1080p in image quality. But because you're rendering less resolution, you're not going to need as much VRAM. And so we can see now that the performance number is identical between the two GPUs. Having more than 8 gigabytes of VRAM only helps your performance if your game is actually trying to use more than 8 gigabytes of VRAM. Here, where I'm also testing out what about DLSS quality. Which is more of, I believe, a 2/3 of each axis rendering resolution. So that would be more like rendering at 1440p and then upscaling to 4K. And here we're once again seeing identical performance. Now, sometimes in our footage, in our results here, we're going to see like a 1 FPS or 2 FPS difference. That's more likely either run-to-run variance or the fact that while both of these are 4060 Ti's, and as I said, the only real difference between them is the VRAM capacity, they're not the same model of 4060 Ti. So they have a different cooler, they're from a different manufacturer. So you could notice, slight differences. So if we're talking something, 5% or less performance difference, especially if it's 1 FPS, I would chalk that up to either run-to-run variance or slight differences between cooler models and boost frequencies. But again, more often than not, when we're not using more than 8 gigabytes of VRAM, we're going to be just absolutely locked. You can see at 4K high settings, we're also well under 8 gigabytes of VRAM. Now in this video, again, we're focusing on Unreal Engine 5 games because they're kind of the future of gaming. Yes, there are a lot of games using custom engines, and I will touch on that at the end of the video, but most of the testing here is done in 6 of the latest Unreal Engine 5 games. And so many developers have said that they are switching over to Unreal Engine 5 for their future projects that I think it's going to be very interesting to see how Unreal Engine 5 works or doesn't work on this amount of VRAM. As we can see so far, it looks like, at 4K Ultra, we had some issues, but using DLSS reined that in and switching down to the high settings reined that in. What about 1440p? Starting out at the high settings, you can see once again that we're getting almost identical performance. Like I said, 1 FPS difference, especially when we're not reporting more than 8 gigabytes of usage. In fact, we're actually staying under 6 gigabytes. By the way, the first number is the total system allocation. The second number is the per process usage, as reported by MSI Afterburner. And again, when the system RAM is also staying about the same, not necessarily identical, but about the same, we're showing that we're not trying to use more than 8, and there's no need for it to spill over into system RAM on the other card, and our performance numbers are about the same. That's 1440p high settings. But what if we jump on over to ultra settings? Well, at 1440p, we're not having the issue of running over 8 gigabytes of VRAM, and we're not getting the stutters or the increased system RAM usage, and our performance stays about the same. So at least in Lords of the Fallen, it looks like at 1440p, 8 gigabytes of VRAM is actually fine at the native resolution ultra settings. Now that doesn't mean the 4060 Ti is fine, because you can see it's only getting about 35 FPS average and 30 FPS in the 1% lows. But remember, this video is mostly about the VRAM differences. However, if you're interested, this is also a really good video for how well does the 4060 Ti perform in Unreal Engine 5 games. We saw that native 1440p Ultra it wasn't doing great, although the VRAM wasn't the issue, but kicking on DLSS quality actually bumps the averages to close to 60 frames per second and still looks quite good. 1% lows are a bit lower, but again, no VRAM issues that we're noticing here causing the problems. And I just accidentally zoomed in too much here. Let's go ahead and jump on to some other settings. How about 1080p high settings? 1080p high, of course, no VRAM issues here. How's the GPU doing? We're getting around 70 FPS average, 1% lows, close to 60, but not quite there. But overall, I would say pretty good. And kicking on DLSS quality at 1080p Ultra is another way to get yourself to around 70 FPS. But what if what if we wanted to play at 1080p native resolution? Sorry, I'm trying to skip ahead in my thing. This thing's hard to control. Here we go. This tab, there we can skip ahead. 1080p Ultra. We can see, again, no VRAM issues at 1080p Ultra in this game. Average performance only around 50 FPS, though. So we can see Lords of the Fallen is incredibly demanding, and the 4060 Ti isn't really up for 1080p 60 FPS Ultra settings, which is a bit disappointing, but we can see it's not the VRAM causing that issue. So let's go ahead and jump to another game. So this is Talos Principle 2. And once again, we're going to look at all sorts of resolutions and settings. At 4K Ultra, we can see the 16 gigabyte card is trying to allocate 10 gigabytes of VRAM, reporting a per process usage of over 8. And then we can see that the 8 gigabyte card obviously can't do that, so its system RAM usage goes way up. And then performance-wise, we're seeing 14% better performance on the averages, but the 1% lows are 2.5 times the performance, 8 versus 20. So massive difference at 4K Ultra. Now, in Lords of the Fallen, we saw using some DLSS to lower the internal resolution solved the problem. But in Talos Principle 2, it's making the 1% lows a lot closer, but we're actually still seeing a 22% performance advantage at 45 FPS versus 37, and the 1% lows are 36 versus 28, which is a 29% performance advantage for the card with more VRAM. And we can see here that the total system allocation is going over 9 gigabytes in this game, and we can see the system RAM around 5 gigabytes versus going up near 8 gigabyte system RAM per process usage on the 8 gigabyte card. So that's definitely showing some issues. If we go to DLSS performance to reduce it down to about a 1080p internal resolution, but staying at the Ultra settings and 4K reconstruction, we can see that the allocated VRAM is reporting over 8, and RAM, total system RAM around 5 on the 16 gigabyte card. We can see system RAM up and performance down on the other cards. So in Talos Principle 2, we're actually still seeing an 18% performance advantage and 21% in the 1% lows, even going all the way down to DLSS performance mode, which is that 1080p internal render. So it's looking like the Ultra settings at 4K just cannot be handled on an 8 gigabyte card in this game, at least not up to full performance numbers. But what if you drop down to the high preset? 4K high, native resolution, no upscaling, stays under 8 gigabytes of VRAM, at least in this scene. Performance becomes identical between the two GPUs. So we can see that the high preset solves the VRAM issue. It also boosts performance significantly, although we're still only in the 30s, but again, keep in mind that we're on a 4060 Ti. Let's go ahead and jump down to 1440p Ultra. So 1440p Ultra, we're actually seeing a performance advantage for the 16 gigabyte card, 17% in the averages, 9% in the 1% lows. And once again, we can see the trend of increased system RAM usage and reported over 8 gigabyte allocation on the 16 gigabyte card. So Ultra settings, even at 1440p, can't be handled to their full potential on the 8 gigabyte card in Talos Principle 2. What about kicking on DLSS quality to rein in VRAM usage? By lowering the internal resolution doesn't solve the problem. You can still see reported allocation over 8. We can still see the 8 gigabyte card using more system RAM, and we can still see a large difference in the performance. 18% advantage in the averages and 19% in the 1% lows. What if we drop down to high settings like we saw at 4K resolution? That solves the problem, and we're now averaging 69 nice on both GPUs with only a 1 FPS difference in the 1% lows, which again, more like a run-to-run variance, not reporting any differences in the VRAM allocation or system RAM. So seems like high settings solve the problem. What about at 1080p? Can an 8 gigabyte card even handle 1080p Ultra? Well, we're still seeing a report of the 16 gigabyte card trying to use, or at least allocate a little bit more than 8. and it having a small difference in the system RAM, although it's very small. The average performance is about the same, although the 1% lows, where sometimes you get increased stutters on the frame time graph occasionally, did still show an advantage. Did DLSS quality rein that in? Well, actually, we're still seeing more system RAM usage on the 8GB card, and we're actually now seeing advantages in the averages and the 1% lows. So it's really looking like the Ultra settings in Talos Principle 2 cannot be handled at least as well on an 8GB card, and it does introduce issues even at 1080p resolution in this scene. Also, I haven't played much of Talos Principle 2, and just the intro area of the game. I've seen some comments on my other videos testing the scene saying that later in the game is significantly more demanding on the GPU. I don't know if it's more demanding on the VRAM specifically, but can be more demanding from just an overall performance perspective. However, once again, dropping down to the high preset solves the problem. We're also averaging about 100 FPS here. So we can perform extremely well using the high preset. What about another game? This is Jusant, or perhaps I should pronounce it Jusant, I don't know. Here I'm starting out at 4K Ultra with DLSS Performance Mode enabled, and if I back up there for a second, because I think I skipped ahead too much, you can see that Performance Mode upscaling, so again, 1080p internal resolution, GPUs are performing about the same. We're getting about a 60 FPS average, although I will mention that certain scenes are much more demanding than others. If you go back to the initial little cave area, you can see it's much more demanding. But in this game, we can test out something else, frame generation. The first two games we tested didn't offer frame generation. Actually, I'll pause and talk about that for a second. They both initially launched with frame generation and then removed support for it, at least on most driver versions, because of crashing issues. So that seems to be a common issue in several Unreal Engine 5 games, saying that the frame generation causes crashing issues and the game developers removed support for it. Anyway, some other games are still leaving it enabled though, and I want to mention that frame generation can increase VRAM usage. DLSS upscaling reduces VRAM usage. Frame generation increases VRAM usage. It can also have an impact on overall system latency. And so actually, if I zoom out a little bit here on my footage, I am running the NVIDIA overlay to monitor system latency. Now, I have noticed occasionally it seems to bug out and not report correctly, and it's again just a software measurement of that. It's not like click-to-photon latency, but it at least gives you some idea of what's going on with that. Anyway, zooming out a bit here, we can see that going to DLSS quality, so increasing that internal resolution, we're still not really affected by the VRAM amount. And then if we kick on frame generation, this was odd, okay? I'm actually seeing the 8GB card do better in the 1% lows, but if I actually back up the footage for just a second here, I think it's just that the amount of tests I'm running here, I wasn't able to do like 3-run averages, and you can see some spikes in the frame time graph here. And I'll just say that sometimes Unreal Engine 5 is just stuttery. And I think that we got an unlucky run on these stutters here on the 16GB card, and our averages are the same, where we went through that little bridge section and just got more stutters than we saw on the 8GB card, although the 8GB card also had some stutters. And I think that explains this result, and I have a feeling if I had time to do like 3 runs each and average them, it would probably smooth out that difference. So I think that's kind of an anomaly in the data set. Anyway, I tried pushing it up all the way to native resolution at 4K, and we can see here again, tied in performance. Performance is overall quite bad, but our VRAM is not reporting a major difference between the two, going over 8GB or anything like that, and performance is staying the same. So let's go ahead and look at 4K high settings. Again, performance about the same, and again, staying under 8GB of VRAM usage, so nothing to see here. 1440p, performance about the same at Ultra settings. And what about 1440p DLSS quality? Again, that just reduces VRAM usage, so nothing to see here other than performance goes up. What about frame generation? That increases VRAM usage, but not enough to go over 8 gigabytes, performance numbers staying about the same here. And what about going down to high settings? We already weren't over 8 gigabytes of VRAM, so nothing to see here other than performance goes a lot up compared to Ultra settings. 1080p Ultra, again, performance staying about the same between the two GPUs, and we're well under 8 gigabytes. What about DLSS quality at 1080p? Performance goes up, but again, reduces VRAM usage, not increasing it. And what about using frame generation? Increases VRAM usage, but we still stay under 8 gigabytes. So the minor differences we're seeing between the cards here would be more likely to be run-to-run variance rather than any difference in the VRAM usage. Let's go ahead and look at high settings. Again, performance numbers go up, but we're already under 8 gigabytes of VRAM, so that's not nothing to see here regarding that. So overall, Jusant did not seem to be a VRAM-hungry game. What about RoboCop Rogue City jumping back up to 4K Ultra? At 4K Ultra, are we seeing anything interesting? We are reporting more than 8 gigabytes of allocation, and system RAM here, per process usage around 6 gigabytes, here going up over 7. So what does that mean for us? Well, that could result in slightly better performance in the 1% lows by 11%. Could be run-to-run variance, but again, given the reports here on these stats, seems more like it would actually be being caused by the VRAM differences. And when we kick on DLSS quality to lower the internal rendering resolution and lowers the VRAM usage, we're still seeing reports of a little bit over 8 here, but not quite as much, and our performance numbers are evening out here. So seems like at least 8 gigabytes isn't an issue here, although I will mention that the other thing that running out of VRAM can do, besides reduce performance or cause crashing, is it can cause textures to not load properly. I do have the video footage here, and you can kind of look around. I don't see evidence of that happening here, but sometimes that can be pretty difficult to spot. Anyway, what if we turn on frame generation? Remember how frame generation increases VRAM, and we were right on that 8 gigabyte borderline? Well, now we're definitely spilling over that. It's definitely filling up system memory, and the 1% lows are over double the performance. And look at that spiky frame time graph on the 8 gigabyte card. Very stuttery, showing up in the 1% lows, being 19 versus 41 and 40 versus 52. So your ability to use frame generation can be affected by your VRAM capacity, since if you are on your borderline and then you kick on frame generation, it can cause issues. Frame generation off and going down to DLSS performance mode, we're under 8 gigabytes of VRAM and our performance numbers are lining up. And what if we kick on frame generation? Well, now using DLSS performance mode seems to have reduced VRAM usage enough to not be showing major performance differences between the two cards. Actually, the 8 gigabyte card is showing slightly better 1% lows. Again, this could be run-to-run variance and Unreal Engine 5 having stutter issues. Unless something weird is happening here where there is reduced textures or something happening on the 8 gigabyte card and that actually boosts its performance somehow, or something like that, I don't know. But I would guess more likely run-to-run variance, maybe. If we drop down to high settings at 4K at native resolution, we can see that we are under 8 gigabytes of VRAM, and 1 FPS difference in average, I would say, is more likely difference between the coolers or run-to-run variance or something along those lines. Let's go ahead and jump to some other settings. How about 1440p resolution? Ultra settings, nothing to see here. We're performing identically, VRAM's under control, so I don't think 1440p is going to be too consequential. Kicking on DLSS quality boosts frame rate averages to about 70 and 1% lows to 60, and they're performing identically. Kicking on frame generation, again, that will increase VRAM usage, but just to that 8 gigabyte borderline, so it looks like the 8 gigabyte card is fine. Performance numbers are about the same. What about high settings? Again, we already weren't having issues at 1440p Ultra, so high also not causing any issues. Although our average performance numbers are only in the 50s, so it's, you know, the 4060 Ti is not exactly impressive performance here at 1440p, but, you know, it is what it is. 1080p Ultra, we're again seeing about the same performance between the two GPUs. No VRAM related issues that we seem to be able to spot here. And so turning on DLSS will just boost performance, but won't really affect the difference between the two cards, because again, there's not really a VRAM issue to notice here. Kicking on frame generation, again, can increase VRAM usage, but not beyond the 8 GB limit here, so cards are still performing about the same. 1080p high settings. Again, no VRAM issues, so performance goes up and stays about the same between the two GPUs, averaging around 80 now. What about Immortals of Aveum? At 4K Ultra, massive difference in the 1% lows. You're going to see a lot more stutters on the 8 GB card. The average performance difference is only 10%, which is 2 FPS here, but we're seeing 10 versus 17, which again is a 70% boost on performance for the 16 GB card. So yeah, both cards are completely out of the playable zone. How much VRAM do you actually need? About 10 GB. So this is useful information beyond just these two cards, right? So yeah, looks like 10 GB is right about where we would want to be, and having a little more cushion than that seems like it would be nice to have. Does kicking on DLSS performance mode solve the issue? Seems like it does. We're now only a 1 or 2, actually 3 FPS difference here, but not a lot in it. We are still reporting more than 8 GB allocation on this side, so it is possible, you know, that 3 FPS average difference. It's still the game still wants more than 8 GB of VRAM, but we're not seeing those massive stutters like we were at the native resolution. We're almost averaging 60 FPS here now. Again, that's a 1080p internal resolution. But what about kicking on frame generation? So DLSS performance got things under control, but kicking on frame generation puts us over 10 GB of VRAM allocation on the card that has it. And we're now filling up system RAM and stuttering massively. Look at this frame time graph. It's like a hedgehog. We have over 11 times the performance in the 1% lows, 4 to 46, and the averages are 46 versus over 60. So massive differences here. DLSS quality, no frame generation, ultra settings 4K. We're seeing some small differences in performance, could be run-to-run variance. The game is reporting more than 9 GB of allocation, but the per process usage is staying under 8. System RAM is filling up here, so again, is it possible that there's some texture loading differences here that aren't showing up in the performance numbers? That is possible. I'm not able to visually spot it myself, but again, maybe things aren't loading in quite as smoothly or something. Who knows? What about kicking on frame generation? DLSS quality with frame generation just literally crashed the 8 GB card. I kept trying to make this work and it just wouldn't. So infinitely better performance on the 16 GB card. We can see it trying to use 10 GB allocation, almost about a 9 GB per process usage. And yeah, the 8 GB card just was completely unstable at those settings. 1440p Ultra, we're seeing a 3 FPS difference in the 1% lows and 2 FPS difference, so 5% and 10% on the averages. We are showing more than 8 GB allocation, so not a lot in it, but there is a measurable difference. Kicking on DLSS quality actually still shows a bit of a measurable difference here between the two, and we are still showing more than 8 GB allocated on the card that has more than 8 GB available. So not a lot in it, but there is a difference. What about kicking on frame generation at 1440p Ultra DLSS quality? Well, this time we're not crashing and I'm not getting the stuttery frame time graph, and we're not seeing a lot of difference between the numbers here. We are showing more than 8 GB allocation on the card that has it. So again, is there any weird texture issues happening here? Not that I noticed, but that doesn't mean it couldn't be there. What about 1080p resolution at 1080p Ultra? We are showing, again, some measurable differences between the 8 GB and the 16 GB card. And we're showing more than 8 GB allocation. There's not a lot in it, but there is a measurable difference between the two. So even at 1080p resolution. Kicking on DLSS quality, I'm still seeing a measurable difference between the two and still showing a little bit more than 8 GB allocation on the card that has it. So again, nothing dramatic, but there is a bit of a difference. Kicking on frame generation actually seems to even them out though, interestingly. Again, is there any other kind of texture loading differences or anything like that happening? It's possible. What about jumping to Remnant 2? Remnant 2, we're seeing at 4K Ultra, not reporting more than 8 GB of VRAM, and we're showing the same performance numbers here. Now, this game, I'm not going to test the high settings, and also Immortals of Aveum, I didn't test high settings. Immortals of Aveum doesn't have any overall global presets, so you have to adjust every setting individually. So I just left it at max settings for Ultra and didn't test out high. Remnant 2 has global presets, but the Ultra preset and the high preset perform almost identically. I've measured that in other videos, so I'm not going to bother with that here, but we will look at the Ultra preset. But like I said, you could look at the performance numbers, but nothing ever went over 8 GB of VRAM, so I didn't see anything too interesting here. I was curious if frame generation would push us over 8 GB, and our card that has it will report more than 8 GB allocation, but we're not seeing noticeable differences really in the actual performance numbers. So again, is there any kind of difference in texture loading? Not that I can see visually in my recordings, but could it be there? I don't know, possibly. 4K Ultra DLSS performance, again, numbers are about the same, and we're reporting under 8 GB of usage. Kicking on frame generation does show more than 8 GB allocation on the card that has it. Interestingly, if there's a performance difference in the 1% lows, it's actually the 8 GB card with the advantage, but I don't know, run-to-run variants, Unreal Engine stutters, maybe loading less stuff, and I just don't notice it in the footage. I don't know. 1440p Ultra, we actually are seeing a bit of a advantage for the 16 GB card in the 1% lows, but again, Unreal Engine 5 can be stuttery, and there can be a difference in the run-to-run variants at times. 1440p Ultra DLSS quality, again, slight advantage in the 1% lows to the 16 GB card. 1440p Ultra DLSS quality plus frame generation, they're showing about the same, and we are reporting under 8 GB of VRAM usage. 1080p Ultra, again, it's showing under 8 GB. The 16 GB card is showing a slight improvement in the 1% lows. 1080p Ultra DLSS quality, again, the slight advantage in the 1% lows is still there on the 16 GB card, despite us not showing any VRAM differences really in the testing. Kicking on frame generation does slightly increase the difference in the 1% lows, but again, we're not showing stats on the actual RAM or VRAM that seem to indicate the VRAM being the difference maker there, so interesting. And that's all my Unreal Engine 5 testing I have for you. Now, I do have some other testing in a previous video. Here, it's like Danielception. I don't know. I do have a previous video where I looked at these same two cards in some of the newest games of 2023 at the time. This is now a while ago, at a bunch of different settings. And I think that's especially interesting because those games often offered ray tracing. And looking at, so you can look at that video for more of the details, but ray tracing increases VRAM, and an interesting trend I've seen in all of the Unreal Engine 5 games that I've tested so far is that the vast majority of them, including these 6 that I tested here, don't offer the hardware-accelerated ray tracing version of Lumen. It's all just the software-based one as far as I can tell, and we're not seeing those big VRAM increases that go along with that. Whereas the set of games I tested in my previous video, the games often did offer ray tracing differences. So we had like Cyberpunk, Forspoken, Resident Evil 4, Jedi Survivor, Ratchet & Clank all offered ray tracing. And we could see that even at 1080p resolution, there was often a spillover past the 8 GB of VRAM. At 1440p, it was even more common. And at 4K, 8 GB for ray tracing at 4K resolution just was not a good situation to be in. But anyway, back to today's video. Let's look at some summary charts like this. So to try to pull all of this information together, first let's look at native resolution, no upscaling, no frame generation at the ultra settings. And I ended up not actually calculating averages for this, but whatever. We can see that at 1080p resolution, there's not a lot in it. These single-digit performance differences, especially in the like 1 to 2% differences, like I said, these are slightly different cards with different cooler models on them. There's also run-to-run variants, and I'm just doing 1 run rather than a 3-run average. So because of the volume of testing this already was, this took a huge amount of time. So not a lot in the averages here, maybe a bit showing up in the 1% lows, specifically in Talos, well, especially in Talos Principle 2, Immortals of Aveum, and possibly Remnant 2 at 1080p. At 1440p, you know, I realize I could probably make this chart bigger. At 1440p resolution, again, Talos Principle 2 is kind of the standout here. But most games were fine with 8 GB of VRAM, at least in the averages. Immortals of Aveum may be showing some improvement in the 1% lows and possibly also in Remnant 2. Again, Talos Principle. At 4K resolution, we're seeing actual crashing happening in Lords of the Fallen and some massive differences in Talos Principle 2 on the 1% lows especially, Immortals of Aveum especially. So we can see 8 GB of VRAM in Unreal Engine 5 for 4K Ultra. Definitely not looking good. Very borderline at 1440p. And 1080p resolution, not too bad, but maybe losing a little bit of performance there. In high settings, for the most part, it seems like that brought things under control. Now notice I didn't test Immortals of Aveum at high because there was no high overall preset, and Remnant 2 I've tested before that it's basically the same as the Ultra preset. Tiny differences, but not enough to be worth all the extra benchmark runs. 1080p resolution at high seems pretty much run-to-run variance type numbers. 1440p, pretty much run-to-run variance type numbers, and also at 4K resolution. So Unreal Engine 5, at least in these 6 games, the high preset does seem to work well at 8 GB, all the way up to 4K resolution, at least in the games I have to test here, which seems really good. Good news for people with an 8 GB card. No, you're not gonna be able to max everything out, but the high preset can still look pretty good, and you can probably be fine. What about turning on DLSS as well as DLSS frame generation? I think frame generation offers one of the really interesting results that we have here, where we see that frame generation increases VRAM, whereas DLSS Super Resolution decreases VRAM. And so sometimes that brought us into some interesting situations, especially at 4K resolution, where we see that 4K DLSS quality, other than Talos Principle 2, where we were seeing some issues, most of the games ran fine at 4K DLSS quality on the 8 GB card. By the way, these are calculated as the percentage difference, so the advantage percentage for the 16 GB card. I probably should have mentioned that earlier, but that's what I'm listing here. So Talos Principle 2 was showing that 8 GB not enough in that game, but when we kick on frame generation, we introduced problems in RoboCop that we didn't have before. We introduced crashing in Immortals of Aveum that we didn't have before. So we can see that frame generation, even at DLSS quality, at 4K resolution, 8 gig, you know, right? We're tipping over that 8 GB line. And if we zoom out a bit here again, if we look at DLSS performance mode, again, most of the games were fine with 8 GB at 4K Ultra DLSS performance, except for Talos Principle 2. And then kicking on frame generation worked fine in the games that had it, except for Immortals of Aveum, where we did see some issues, and especially in the 1% lows, where it was just massively stuttery, and we saw an over 10 times performance advantage for the card with more than 8 GB of VRAM. Interestingly, while these other differences weren't massive, they're actually showing all in favor of the 8 GB card, where I'm almost wondering if there's something interesting happening there where perhaps like I said, maybe textures weren't loading in properly, and that actually ended up giving a performance advantage for the 8GB card because it had less to process. I'm actually curious about that because all these negative percentages are indicating the 8GB card had the advantage, not the 16GB card. So that's interesting. Dropping down to 1440p, we can see that DLSS quality, 1440p Ultra, mostly fine, except for Talos Principle 2. And introducing frame generation did not seem to cause issues there. At 1080p, DLSS quality, everything pretty much fine, except for Talos Principle 2, still seeing some advantages for the 16GB card, but they seem to handle frame generation okay. Or about the same. Remnant 2 may be showing a bit of an advantage there on the 16GB card. So that's pretty much the results for this video. Again, reminder that I do have non-Unreal Engine 5 game version of this video that I did in July or August, something like that. This particular test at least was July. Anyway, and then, well, I've already kind of gone over the ray tracing results for that. We could pop into some of the results for that. Again, remember ray tracing, we saw a lot of differences in these, again, not Unreal Engine 5 games, except for Remnant 2 happened to be Unreal Engine 5, but most of this not. We did see even at 1080p resolution at ultra settings, we did see some games like Last of Us Part 1 and Ratchet & Clank did want more than 8GB of VRAM, even at 1080p. 1440p, same games, had those things, and at 4K, same games, but it was an even more dramatic difference in them. And I did also test some of those games at high settings, and at high settings, the vast majority of the games tested were fine with 8GB at 1080p, but Ratchet & Clank still wanted more and performed a lot better on the 16GB card. 1440p, same game, and 4K, same game, had some issues. 1440p, most games were fine, but Forspoken started to have bigger issues, going from an 8% advantage to an 18% advantage here. And at 4K resolution, more games had issues, but still not all of them. So, what do we make of all of this? I mean, I don't know if I have any massive conclusion to make for you other than the fact that, you know, at the lower resolutions, seems to be less of an issue, but 8GB can be an issue at 1080p Ultra in some of the games tested, not all of them, but I would expect that to go up over time in how often that becomes an issue. What else did we notice here? 4K resolution, yeah, 8GB is going to be causing problems. Frame generation can cause problems when you spill over VRAM capacity. And ray tracing, again, in my other videos testing, can definitely cause issues with the lower VRAM amounts. Now, you can see crashing, you can see stutters, you can see all sorts of things. But I think one of my biggest takeaways here is that the high settings were mostly fine. And that was in all of the Unreal Engine 5 games, high settings were actually fine on 8GB of VRAM, even going up to 4K resolution. And if we look at my older video, if we see the high settings did actually spill over in some games, but not all of them. So my overall takeaway is if you have an 8GB card, it's not necessarily garbage. High settings, you're probably okay at most resolutions, but not in every single game. And again, I'd expect that to go up over time. So I think that's my biggest takeaway, is I don't think you need to throw away an 8GB card, but it's clearly not the target for max settings moving forward. So I think it would be nice to have more VRAM than that. Now, I didn't focus a lot on the total VRAM usage. In most of these Unreal Engine 5 games, though, it did seem to not go over 12 in really any of the testing that I saw. I think Talos Principle 2 was probably our most VRAM hungry game that we saw in our Unreal Engine 5 testing, and at 4K Ultra, we're still only allocating around 10GB of VRAM. That gives you a little bit of headroom to kick on frame generation. Now, some games are more VRAM demanding than Unreal Engine 5 games. But that's the overall results we have for this video. It's really long, so I should probably just stop talking and let you guys go. Also, is there any interest in me uploading this entire, geez, what is this, 52 minutes of benchmarks? I don't think it would do well on the main channel, so I'm considering channel members. If you've hit the join button, I do have like members only videos where, is there any interest in me just uploading this massive thing where you can look at it, just any part that you want in detail? Because I was kind of skipping around in this video. So maybe I'll put that up as a members exclusive just for anybody who wants to see it. I don't know, not sure if there's interest. But then also a huge thank you to subscribers for hitting that button, a huge thank you to channel members, and huge thank you to today's sponsor, Jawa.gg, where again, if you're feeling the pressure on your GPU, you can sell it to fund your upgrade and use code OWEN10 to save $10 off your first purchase. I hope all of you have an excellent day.